Okay, everyone. It is 12:02 on the West Coast and just 2 after. So I wanted to welcome all of you to our Openscapes community call. I'm Erin Robinson. I co-direct Openscapes with Julie Lowndes, who's one of our featured speakers today, with Alison Hill from RStudio as well today for this call. Before we get started, I wanted to remind everybody that we are abiding under the Openscapes Code of Conduct and that all of you is welcome here. And so we're all learning as we go. And I'm really excited for us to be able to sort of nerd out with Alison and Julie about R Markdown, but all of your questions, all of your ideas, all of that is welcome. And we are respectful, direct and professional, inclusive, and open to learning from others. If you have questions that you want Alison and Julie to answer, topics you want to raise, just put those in the chat and I'll be collecting them for the discussion period. So the way that the call is going to work today, we have a pre-recorded video of Alison and Julie having a conversation. So we'll play that. Then we'll give Alison and Julie a few minutes to react because it's been just a few months since they recorded that. Julie has a new haircut. And in the meantime, and then we'll have a Q&A and discussion. And we have a pretty good chunk of time devoted to that because we really want these community calls to be a discussion for all of us. So with that, Julie, what am I forgetting? Anything else you want to add to this welcome?
No, thanks so much, Erin. We're so excited that you all are here for this conversation and also are so appreciative to Alison Hill for joining us at our Openscapes community call and for sharing all of her R Markdown wisdom with us. So I will go ahead and screen share and
maybe while we're doing that, Alison, anything else you want to say to set this up?
No, I really appreciate the invite and thanks for this setup. It has been a while since we recorded this video. There's always some angst about watching yourself, but yeah, I'm excited to hear the reactions and especially to hear people's questions about using R Markdown, especially from the lens of scientific researchers, because that's where Julie and I both I think are coming from. So thank you.
Yeah, great, and we'll be in chat as well throughout the video. So. Yeah, so there'll be opportunity there as well. Cool. So I will go ahead and hit share. And here we go.
Hi, I'm Alison Hill. I work at RStudio where I'm the product manager for data science communication. And that means that I work on products, including R Markdown, that make it easier and more delightful for people who work with data to communicate about data. I'm also a recovering academic researcher.
Alison is also the R Markdown whisperer, which is how we know her on the internet.
Very uncomfortable with that label.
No, it's really great to be here with you, Alison. I'm Julie Lowndes. I am a marine ecologist and the founder and co-director of Openscapes. And I'm based at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis at UC Santa Barbara in California. And I am a longtime R Markdown user and champion. It's been a big part of my research and my career, and it's been fun to evolve with R Markdown as it can do new things. So it's really fun to be here, and I always love chatting with you about R Markdown. I always learn something every time we talk.
I really feel like you've kind of your whole career has kind of grown up with R Markdown. As it's been growing, you've been growing too. And what I really love about your current work through Openscapes is that you're really working to change the hearts and minds of researchers about open and kinder science. And it's not just about tools, but you are using tools that support these changes in mindsets and workflows and culture. And I think that's so cool. And that's why I love talking with you about this stuff.
Yeah, Me too. Me too.
So since Julie and I talk so much about this stuff, and we actually do pretty frequently, we thought it might be helpful to open up our conversation and try to distill down some of the reasons why we're so enthused about using R Markdown in our own careers, and why we think it really is so transformative for scientists. So let me show you the tool that we're talking about.
Yeah,
Go
let's
ahead
see
and
it.
jump in and share my screen. So this is an R Markdown document.
Yay!
It's a friend. So this is a friendly workspace that I think of. So this is a pretty short R Markdown document, and this is simple plain text, meaning that everything that you see here can be typed with a plain keyboard. What you're looking at is full sentences written in English that are the white parts. So that's just plain text. And then you can see that you also have code blocks in gray. So this is where your R code actually goes. And you can edit the R code just like you can edit, a word in a sentence in the same document. And so these are all together. And it seems kind of simple. But, if you were a scientist and you lived in a world without R Markdown, you would wish for exactly this kind of tool, right?
Oh my gosh.
You would invent it in your head and you would say, why did nobody make something like this?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's really, that's one of the ways that it's changed my life. My research life used to be, my mind used to be split in 3 different places when I would be doing analysis.
Yes.
I used to write my code in a script.
Right.
I would write my motivation and my notes to myself in a Word document. And then, the code would, output tables or output figures, and those would live somewhere else, right? Like in a separate folder for my figures, or in a separate folder for my tables, or, how did I even make tables? I can't even think about it. But like here, that's all here in the same place. Like there's this text in the white and there's code in the gray. And actually what's amazing about this, are we going to show knitting this document?
I am about to. I'm right along with you, Julie.
Awesome. So, here, like the text and the code are together, and they're actually also together with those plots. So what's going on here? We've just pushed a magical button called knit. That's actually, that's what it's doing. It's like knitting this text and this code together while it's executing the code. And so like, yeah, I just think about those 3 places my mind used to be and the 3 places my files used to be. I spent a lot of time in the moment doing meticulous bookkeeping, and then a lot of time later, like trying to piece together, the forensics or the detective work that would go into like, did this plot really come from that code? Or like, I wrote a half thought there, but did that connect?
Yeah, and sometimes your notes to yourself are not entirely helpful,
Yeah.
But it's like, tell me a pre-R Markdown horror story, and it's like, I had what I did and how I did it and why I did it in separate places, and that was like what my workflow was like too. I would be pretty paranoid. I remember anytime I needed to submit anything that was official, if I had to submit a poster abstract even, or a grant application or a paper for publication, I remember feeling like I needed to do about a week's worth of pretty paranoid cross-checking of the plots, the tables, every statistic that I was reporting, needed to make sure that I knew exactly where it was coming from in my document. And that was just a huge burden that I carried around with me always, because I was always dealing with human participants where samples were kind of in flux, and inclusion and exclusion criteria might be, being applied in different ways. And so I was always terrified that these things were not going to match up. And so for me, when I started using R Markdown, it was like I could just kind of let that stress go. Like I just let it all out, and I knew what the input was. I knew the data coming into the document, and I knew that the output coming out of it depended on that data. And it was just so satisfying and calming for me that I was able to link those two. They were always able to stay in sync. And I just felt like I'd kind of reached like research nirvana there, that I didn't have to worry about this thing that always used to take up so much of my cognitive energy to worry about.
Yeah. I think, it's funny because we often talk about R Markdown for reproducibility, because there's the code and the input and the output together, like you said. And I think like an additional part of reproducibility is that reducing that cognitive load lets the scientists spend time on the science rather than on the bookkeeping and this detective work that takes a lot of energy and stress, right?
You're like worrying about
cool.
reporting the wrong result or having the wrong plot, linked up with the wrong text. I mean, it really is like reproducibility. You focus a lot on the quality of data and the code, but it's also about like researcher quality of life. And what we're
100%.
really getting at, and what I think we have both experienced in our careers, is that even just a simple change in tool set can actually change your whole mindset, right?
Yeah. So this tool completely changed my mindset. And in fact, I, when I was visioning Openscapes, like I think R Markdown played a huge role in kind of realizing that vision for Openscapes, because you showed knitting that R Markdown into an HTML. That totally changed the way I worked with my research team, because instead of emailing somebody a Word document with my current thoughts or our current, instructions about our science, right, I could instead create a HTML document and send them to a website where something was always up to date. So I wasn't having to email them a different version or be embarrassed about having to email them again and say, wait, this version,
right? Right. Like how soon is too soon to send another email with an updated version?
Right. But this rhythm that I got into about having communication be a part of my daily workflow with my analysis, and actually being able to update that often on HTML and through websites, was a big part of designing Openscapes. And so let me show you, can I show you the Openscapes website?
I love the Openscapes website.
I do too. It's so great. It's made with R Markdown.
It is.
It is right here. It's beautiful. It's made with blogdown. So the design of it is lovely, and it's something that I didn't code. And the artwork is lovely and beautiful by Alison Horst. And what this let me do was, I had the vision and the content for what I wanted to say about Openscapes.
Right.
And then with our Markdown and this familiarity I had with coding and putting things online, let me then have a place to realize that. And here I can, blog and not only, tell my stories, but tell other scientists' stories, and like have a place where these stories can be told. And, knowing our Markdown has been a big part of like visioning this. And like, I'm not a web developer, I'm not a software engineer, but
right,
I can play one.
Yeah, I can play one on the internet.
With R Markdown. Let me show you one other thing with R Markdown.
Bookdown.
Bookdown has been such an amazing game changer too, for writing documents and organizing documents, as books. And this is by some of the champions that have come through the Openscapes program. We talk about codes of conduct, and we talk about onboarding and the practice of onboarding people to your lab, and sort of writing down practices for how people can start contributing to science sooner and sort of become part of the culture. And the Fay Lab here put that into a book. So this is their book of magical secrets.
I love this so much, because I feel like this is exactly what I wish I would have done as the PI of my lab, because we have all these pieces in place, but they're usually not in the same place. And usually there's like individual keepers of knowledge of each little bit, and to be able to have a place to collect all those and let people share that knowledge. And this is kind of like the exercise of like writing down the tribal knowledge that research assistants, graduate students, postdocs, every single person that contributes to your research comes and goes and gets little snippets of it. And, just to be able to have a lab resource that evolves over time, that, people can contribute to, and that, grows as the research grows. That's just such a wonderful time-saving resource, but it's also like a great cultural resource for getting everybody to feel like they're part of something bigger.
It really is. That's so well said. And I think like, you know, what's cool too with this onboarding book is that someone joining the lab, you know, reads the contents and learns from it. And also this is a way to also learn the skills of R Markdown and how to contribute to this book, and then help maintain it and pass, you know, new knowledge forward, or like if there was a gap in something or a URL needed to be updated, like that's a part of that contributing process.
Yeah. Because
Both
there's
to the
probably no
culture and
code
the
there,
skills.
right?
Yeah, there's no
There's
code.
no R code.
Yeah, there's no R code here or
Yeah.
in the website. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, but it's a really neat way to kind of you know, have both the technical skills and the cultural practice together.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it sort of becomes part of their daily practice, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's, for me, I think when I think back about how I started using R Markdown, I think as a scientist, I felt a little bit like an imposter user, like I was using it wrong because I wasn't using R Markdown for writing my actual scientific publications, like my actual papers that were the things that I submitted to a journal and that were, you know, the like up on a pedestal, my published paper. That's not what I wrote in R Markdown, but I used it for all the other stuff in my career and in my research. So I used it like even just, I guess in the past 3 months, I submitted my first paper actually written in R Markdown. That was like a milestone for me. But when I was actually working as a scientist, I used it for, you know, doing my exploratory data analysis, data visualizations, data wrangling work. But I would also do it for all the other stuff that I needed to do that was part of my research career, was like grant progress reports. I did it for my yearly reviews for the Institutional Review Board because I dealt with human subjects data. I did it for lab meeting minutes, my teaching, and I actually even used it to write my my promotion and tenure statement for getting promoted to associate professor. And there was definitely no code in there. It was my happy place. And I, at that point, R Markdown was so seeped into my workflow and so seeped into how I wanted to do things that I thought, I'm not going to fight with a Word document over doing this document. Like this document is hard enough to write, but I wanted to do it in a way that was more true to my actual, how I actually worked as a scientist.
Yeah. That's so cool to hear, like all the different ways you use R Markdown. And I, you know, I've found this the same, you know, it's like my go-to practice now. And it's kind of hard for me to even describe how, how much it's changed my, you know, my science life, but also my life.
Your real life.
My real life. You know, I've tried, you know, I was thinking about this in terms of like how much like your smartphone has changed your life, you know, like like how have your habits changed since you've had a smartphone in your pocket? There's maps on there, there's a camera always with you. Does that make you, you know, if you get lost, are you not lost as long because you can access a map? And actually, are you even braver about where you go on the, you know, on the fly anyway, because you know that you have support and you have ways to kind of, you know, stop being stuck if you get stuck somewhere. I don't know.
I love that analogy because I feel like especially after having just moved, I'm thinking about like, you know, when you hit a detour or a roadblock and you've got your map set up for you, it's like it just automatically like is your co-pilot and gets you to where you need to go, and you're not worried about it. And that is sort of like what using a tool that works for you is like your data changes, or you need to ask a new question, frame a new analysis, or, you know, add a new variable to a model. Like you can do that pretty quickly and iterate, and you're able to get where you need to go. Like you're just able to keep doing it and do your work and focus more on that, and not about, you know, sitting down from square one every time and remapping out the whole thing and figuring out your route. I love that analogy. So I know in this video, we talked a lot about big ideas, but of course we both know, Julie, that it's always different when you actually are staring at a screen and you have this blinking blank cursor and you're like, oh no, what do I do?
So where's the error?
Like, how do I start? Like that paralysis. So we've actually scoped out a few videos in this series. And in the next one, we're going to talk about some real life workflows that we've found can help people get started using R Markdown and help you get on the happy path to using R Markdown for science. So thanks for joining us for this video, and we'll see you for the next ones.
Yay. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks, Alison.
Thanks.
All right.
Yay.
Oh,
Quite the
well,
teaser
that
there.
it is. I know. We had big plans, and then with time passing, we were like, let's have a community call and share this video so far and have a conversation and then see where we go. But yeah, it was really fun. Yeah, it was really fun to do with Alison. And yeah, I don't know. What are your reflections, Alison? And then I saw a lot in chat, so we can get to that.
Yeah, I saw a lot in chat too that it's interesting because it sort of echoes a lot of the things that I think, you know, I probably experienced and you did too when you were first using it. Like, I think there's a lot of, I think one of our discussion points before we filmed that video was that we wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about the intermediate work products that we felt like R Markdown could help us with in our research, because there is so much focus a lot of times on like the writing of the final paper. And you feel like that's the real, like, you know, where the rubber meets the road and where you feel like you really should be using our Markdown. But like, you know, it was like kind of confession time to be like, like, that's not actually how I at least got started using our Markdown, because that's actually one of the harder bits. You know, one of the comments was about like, you know, the struggles with collaboration, track changes, things like that. And granted, those are all complete challenges when you're using this kind of format, if you're working with people who are not also using GitHub and using R and using our Markdown. But I really found that even just for my own, you know, it was collaborative interdisciplinary research with a large research team of about 12 to 15 every quarter. It was nice for me to be able to know that I could use R Markdown for the stuff that I needed to do. And then I brought along my companions kind of one at a time, my students who I trained to use R Markdown, so that we could all be collaborating and using the same tool chain. But it really was, you know, sort of more of an independent thing that I did at first. And I think one of the things that like, one of the strengths of what Julie does is talking a little bit more about the cultural change of like all adopting the same tool instead of forcing, you know, an individual person to kind of like be the change, you know, which is sort of like how I hacked it, which was a little bit of a tough way to go, but it ended up working for me. So I don't know, Julie, if you had any other reflections about that, because I remember we like really very intentionally kind of scoped the conversation towards those intermediate research projects.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think something too, I think that, you know, we were going to talk about it in a follow-up conversation that, that didn't quite fit in this one, but that has come up in chat that the Megsy started too, is the idea of kind of like, you know, our Markdown documents that get unwieldy with the amount of code that are in them, and that, you know, how do you have the narrative speak to one audience without the code getting too much and all that. And I think like, for me, like, I mean, this is getting more in the weeds too and stuff, but the idea of like being able to source a whole script from an R Markdown chunk so that the code isn't all there, but it's running the code, or using, I use child documents a lot with the knit child with R Markdown, so that you can sort of treat your main R Markdown document as like a collection of smaller modules that are all R Markdown documents. And like, if some of them are scripts, that's also fine. So just sort of thinking about these different pieces and modularized workflows. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, modular workflows.
Yeah. I love seeing all this in the chat. Was there any other reflections, Alison, you had, or was there a topic in the chat that you've seen and wanted to say something about? And then I know Erin can help bring up other questions.
Let's see. I'll read through some of the chat questions and maybe Erin can.
Yeah.
Well,
so
Erin can help.
The two kind of big things that are coming up. One is there's a fairly active thread in the chat around unwieldy R Markdown. And I think that people are helping each other there. So there's a nice thread going. The other question that we have is around, and you just touched on this a little bit, around using it for collaboration. And so there was a question that came in ahead of this about wanting to render R Markdown into Google Doc. But I wonder, Allison, just sort of more generally thinking about how to use it as a collaborative tool, and how we might be thinking about versioning and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the struggle is right now that I think probably the biggest bang for your buck in terms of if you want to collaborate with somebody else on an R Markdown document is to be using GitHub. And so I know that's a hard message, because that means that the person on the other side of your collaborative efforts needs to be comfortable enough with being able to use GitHub and Git, which is a pretty high bar. And, I think that that is really something that needs to change, but that's kind of where it's at right now. So I think there's large benefits from learning to use Git and GitHub, but obviously, like in my past life, when I was a researcher, I was collaborating with a senior PI who was 65 years old and was definitely not going to start using Git and GitHub for their career. Like, it just wasn't worth this person's time to learn the basics of setting this stuff up on their computer so they could collaborate with me and do what they could do effectively in Word. So I guess for me, like the past lesson that I took from, at least when I was doing research and working with people who I knew were going to be, basically sales that I couldn't close for using R Markdown, was that was okay. And that I could still use the tool that I needed to use to be effective in my day-to-day life, and then figure out ways to help make that more integrated with the tooling that I had to use on the other end, which was always going to be Word documents for grants. Like, I don't think a grant proposal can ever, at least in my world, for National Institutes of Health grants, could never not be a Word document. The formatting requirements and all of the typeface even requirements are just so crazy that I don't think that would even be a realistic expectation. So I think you kind of have to be able to figure out how the tool can meet your needs, and realize that no one single tool is going to meet all the needs in your whole, like, I think of, because I'm a psychologist, I think of Maslow's hierarchy of, like, you need to have like these base level things to be able to have those in place before you can like deal with the icing and the kind of like cool smaller things you can stack on top of the pyramid. So I feel like, you can kind of treat R Markdown as a little bit of like the base, and then you're going to have to maybe like spread out, use different tools for different things to be able to make a workflow that works for you and for the other people that you have to work with, and to make sure that they don't feel like, you're never going to be able to convince certain people that they need to use it, and they probably shouldn't. Like, if we're really honest with ourselves, I don't love the idea of like telling other people that they need to learn something to be able to work with me, unless I really think it's actually in their best interest for their career or their personal life or something. But sometimes there was just realistically it wasn't going to be something that I knew, my main PI was going to need to use in his life. It just wasn't going to be something that I felt good about making as a requirement to work with me. So I don't know. I guess I feel pretty strongly about like not evangelizing too much and trying to use the things that you want to use locally, and then trying to show that they're so effective that other people want to join in the fun and use them. And hopefully you can bring people along without having it block you too much.
Yeah, I'd say too, like, and kind of that thread about modularization of it too. I know we wrote papers in the past where the methods section would all be written in R Markdown with the code and figures, and that all working and having inline R code executing so that it combines with the methods and results. And then we'd knit that as a Word document, and have that temporarily be a separate Word document compared to the introduction that other folks were writing, and that didn't require so much on code being executed in the conclusion. And then so we'd kind of work in that space with those two Word documents and be iterating on the R Markdown side and outputting and just kind of making that work, and then it's weaving it together for submission. And that worked well with like the folks that were maintaining the code and needing to be able to collaborate around the methods and results a bit more, but having all eyes on it when it came to the Word narrative. Yeah.
So I saw a related question that was, I think, where did it go? It said, get in GitHub for collaborative writing. I find myself struggling to develop a workflow, e.g. how do you translate track changes into pull requests and merges? That's a really great question. And frankly, I have used Git and GitHub a ton more since I joined RStudio than I did before. And now I truly see like the simplicity and the beauty of being able to use it instead of a track changes. So it's not necessarily before the pull request. It's actually your you can do pull requests to yourself, first of all. That's a really fun thing to do. Like I do pull requests to myself all the time, merge it in, it makes me feel really effective. But the nice thing is that every pull request itself is basically like a track changes. It shows you all the documents that were changed, and line by line, it shows you the diff for what changed, what words were changed, anything like that. So pull requests are a great way to be able to actually think of that as like, I'm doing a full track changes on all these things that I did here, and I'm putting it into a pull request. And you can even do it to yourself. It doesn't have to be to anybody else. You can do a pull request from a branch in your own project to the main branch in your own project. And that works great. And you can merge in your own pull requests. And I didn't totally appreciate that when I was a researcher. I kind of thought that I needed to like have a true collaborative project to get that workflow going. But once I started using that workflow in my own personal website to make blog posts, I was like, oh, this is genius. And then you can always see what changes you did, because you can always go back to the linked pull request. And the linked pull request has a really nice view of all of the things that changed. And then if you are actually working with somebody else, inside the pull request like UI on github.com, you have some amazing tools for being able to make inline comments line by line. And then we have discussions around those. So for like the R Markdown team, that's how we review each other's work, is it has to be in a pull request form first. And then you can go in and you can make inline suggestions through the GitHub UI. So I can actually change the wording that somebody else uses. I can make a suggestion for a change of wording. And then the person who issued the pull request can commit the suggestion or not. So then we kind of have a go back and forth, and you can also have discussion kind of threaded chains off of things. So somebody can make a comment about a certain chunk of code, and then you can respond in line. And so you really are able to keep track of like, well, I did it this way because XYZ, or I said it this way because XYZ, and then other people can chime in. So I think like starting with pull request as the thing to include in your workflow is a really great thing to do. And by saying that you have to do a pull request, that means you also have to do a branch. And I think both of those are actually really great recommendations. I would say I never used branches enough. I was always pushing straight to main, which was like just throwing all those cool things away. So making branches and making pull requests to yourself from branches, whether it's a small typo fix or whether it's a huge overhaul of something, I think that's a really effective workflow to start mastering, even if it's just you yourself and I get it going through and merging pull requests and doing branches. If it's just you in a project, I think that can actually be a really wonderful workflow.
That is great. That is great advice. That's something that we're just starting to use more, is like starting to use branches and pull requests and get comfortable in that workflow and practicing that. And I hadn't thought of it as such a powerful way for track changes too. That's awesome. Yeah, sorry, Erin.
Yeah, no, I'm wondering, there's so much good stuff happening in the chat and so many people helping each other. So I'm really sort of wanting to open it up and get some other voices, and wondering if anybody has a question they want to unmute and ask directly of Alison and Julie.
I feel semi-affirmed, because I feel like a lot of the stuff in the comments are exactly what we were scoping out, Julie, when we were talking about the next in the series. I see Perl, child documents, all of those things. So maybe we were actually thinking more clearly about what the next video should be. This is very helpful.
That's great.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of hands. Teresa, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for putting this on. It's super helpful already. I am trying to use R Markdown a lot more. And one of the main things that I get confused by is the latex component. I really don't understand how it fits together. Sometimes when I'll be editing the documents in GitHub, and then when I preview them, there's this weird table at the top that's kind of disconnected from the rest of the document. Is it possible to just talk a little bit about how these two things work together? yeah, and any resources you might have.
We could. I don't. That doesn't sound familiar to me. Like I've seen a lot of bugs, but I haven't seen that particular bug. But that's not to say it doesn't happen. But I don't have an answer for you about why you're seeing that. I think more generally, like if you're. Oh yeah.
Oh, I think I know what the weird table is.
Oh yes, please.
It's wait. Let me actually just add a face to this.
Hi.
Hi. Thanks for everything you're doing for Markdown and all that.
Oh, yeah.
The weird table might be because you're using the Markdown preview in GitHub, and GitHub knows about Markdown, but doesn't know about R Markdown's front matter. So it doesn't know about the YAML header.
Ah.
It doesn't actually break anything. It just doesn't know how to display it properly.
Yeah.
So don't worry too much about that weird thing.
Oh, okay. So it's a inside the GitHub UI when you do a Markdown preview. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I think, generally if you're editing things on the GitHub UI, just to keep in mind that you are just using plain Markdown. And, if you're editing things in your R code or anything like that, like anything that needs to change that way needs to be re-rendered. And then in terms of LaTeX, like I have to admit that I'm blissfully unaware largely of LaTeX other than for like using equations. So I think I've interacted with it probably less than other people have. So I don't know if I think essentially what our Markdown does at a really, really basic level is it allows you to use what's called pandoc to be able to convert your document from some format that is kind of more universal to any other formats that you want, like HTML, PDF, Word document, all those output formats. So it's using that pandoc under the hood. And then we add in that ability to be able to use LaTeX kind of before it hits that pandoc step. So I think depending on your use case and what you're trying to use LaTeX for, it's kind of like a building block that goes ahead of that. And so I don't know what kinds of uses you have for it. If it's like you're adding in, like some people kind of have to add in like certain libraries, like using certain packages basically with LaTeX to be able to add those capabilities in, or if you're trying to use basic LaTeX, but that's kind of the most in a nutshell version of it. But I try to use LaTeX as little as possible, frankly. I'm more of an HTML person.
We have another question from Francisco. Francisco, how do we say your name?
You got it right, like in San Francisco. Thank you, all of you, for putting this together. And my question is a little bit like less about coding, but I'm really curious about this community building superpower that this sort of communication infrastructure creates, because it sounds like great for collaboration among scientists. But I'm also seeing that, like on R Markdown, you can create web pages, you create visualization. So you have a lot of opportunities to engage beyond the scientific bubble. And I wonder if there's a place where all these reflections about this community building and engagement that could be possible through these communication infrastructures like R Markdown are happening. Is there a place where we could find testimonials or ideas or experiences in terms of community building around it?
That is a good question, Francisco. I don't know. Allison might have ideas too. There's other folks on the call, like putting Steph Butland on the spot. There's a lot of cool community building and communication around our Markdown, but I don't know like one single central place where those stories are told. Does anybody else have an idea? Allison?
It might be more tool specific too. Like I see more people, kind of building a community around like the Jupyter ecosystem, and then the R Markdown ecosystem, which I think Openscapes is kind of part of that larger conversation as well. And then there is kind of a budding open source community around Pandoc and sort of open source publishing. I'm trying to, I can't find the link to it right now, but they have an event coming up in October this month. And I think it's kind of organized by some of the people who are the core contributors of Pandoc. So I think that would be a more like, tool agnostic way to kind of try to find an inroad into that community. But I think it's definitely an area where I would love to see like more people, having kind of more domain specific conversations around these tools. Because I think there's a lot of different Open Pub Fest. That is it. Thank you, Julie. So this is put on by a group, or is this one I was thinking of? Propose an event. This one might actually not be the one I was thinking of, but this is a great one also. Yeah, it actually is different. I'll have to find the other one. So this one I don't think is necessarily the one by the Pandoc people, but I'll find the link to it. It's in my Slack. But I think for me, like I came from this this place of being in psychology and feeling like I was all alone, trying to find out like how people could possibly use these tools in psychological research. And it took me a while to figure out like the places where it made sense for me to insert in my workflow. And I imagine that different domains have different places where that makes sense. And especially like if you are using LaTeX or some of these other like kind of fancier add-on things, like what are the typical things that you need to add on to be able to, make this car drive for you? I think that's kind of, those are the tougher conversations for me that I always wished there was space to have those. I wished I could always find somebody else in psychology that was doing what I was doing.
Steph has a hand up, Steph Butland. Wonder if that was in response. Hey, Steph.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, thank you. I wanted to ask Francisco, when you're talking about building community, are you talking about building community around the tools themselves, or is it the example, some of the people here from the NOAA community, like you want to use a lot of tools, but you want to build a community around workflows in your research area? So I'm wondering if Francisco could comment on that.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's more like on actual, because what I find really exciting that Julie mentioned is the terms of culture. And as I said, what I see in R Markdown and in other all the tools that we're using, like the Google Workspace, is as I said, communication infrastructure, right? That's the things that make possible for us to collaborate and communicate with each other. And I'm coming from the perspective of science communication, and I also kind of trying to do kind of like use some of these resources to create visualizations and share with other people and engage them with the science that I'm doing. And I'm finding in R Markdown one of those communication infrastructures around I can build community. But it's not the only one. But I haven't found like, for instance, just to give you a clear example, I'm looking at R for Data Science, the book, and they have the last section of the book is communicate. And it's all about the visual aspects, about how to make things, more digestible. But there is not a section on engagement. How can you use these tools to engage with broader audiences? How can we, take or harness the power of this visualization or sharing a common coding language to build those communities in places like NOAA or the USGS? The USGS, for instance, is also amazing things with visualization with water, but what does it take? How much flexibility do we need to have as a scientist to embrace all these tools and be open to share and even kind of go through the hurdle of learning GitHub? What does it take for us to make those jumps and build those cultures and communities? So, well, I hope that wasn't like a long ramble, but that's kind of like where I'm coming from with that question.
Yeah, no, I think the silence is, it's a big question. And I think there's like a lot of different threads working on that. But I think too, yeah, that the idea, something, I think Alison and I both talked to Hadley Wickham about in terms of that R for Data Science and that graphic that's part of that book that's so, for me, like life-changing about how to think about data science, is that, communication is like one thing at the end, whereas, I think R Markdown specifically can help make communication like the underpinning thing throughout. But then additionally, there is like a final communication in that. So that's something we've talked about, is just how communication is like throughout that whole book. But thinking about community engagement is another piece.
Do you want to screen share real quick so people can see what the graphic is, just in case?
Yes.
Like I have it
Yes.
burned in my brain, but I know.
Yes.
But also that is my
me-
single beef with that graphic is I want like communication to be at like after import, after tidy, after model, after visualization. I want like communicate to be offshooting for every single one of them. I feel like every single one of those nodes in that graphic should have a communicate aspect to them. And that's kind of part of, you know, the challenge of figuring out when a tool can be useful to you, for what purpose you need it for. I think it's an introduction.
Sorry. Introduction. Sorry.
I think it's the first.
It's got a new, beautiful look. Yeah, this graphic.
Yeah. So I feel like communicate should be like offshoot. Like every time you have a new word there, I feel like you should have a communicate offshoot. And like usually for any of those like individual tasks, I would have like an R Markdown maybe just for me, or an R Markdown that I shared with other people. And then, you know, I'd make it useful for myself first, or to my team first, you know, make it something that was helpful to get us to the next stage of what we needed to do. And then putting it at the end makes it seem like it's for the final like scientific communication, the final article, which oftentimes I did not actually use R Markdown for. Even when I felt really comfortable using R Markdown, I would usually eventually get to a point where I had all the graphics, I had all the statistics I needed, and then for whatever journal we needed to submit it to, you had to, you know, get it into that shape. But all the other steps along the way, I would have used a reproducible workflow.
Awesome. I know we've got a few other hands up.
Yeah. So Aiden, I think that's our next hand.
Okay, I can't hear you.
I think you might be muted.
How about now?
Yes.
Awesome. Hi guys, sorry about that. Thank you. I was saying this has all been great, super interesting. I was reflecting on the open source community sharing and on like the open source community and like kind of like the world of sharing. And I was thinking of kind of like the ggplot library that has like examples and code. And I have kind of two questions for you. Is there like a central library of document examples? And also, how often do you start from scratch versus borrowing a RMD that you found that you liked and you basically just replace all the text from there?
Oh, that's interesting. I think the central repository is github.com. You can do a search on there for .rmd documents and you can find everybody's. And the tough thing is that you won't be able to find them domain specifically necessarily, but most of the ones that you find with .rmd will have some code and text in there that are good models. And I think, you know, some I see are like, ooh, I wouldn't do that. Like it's got a lot of, you know, like code in there and I maybe would do it differently and reorganize it. And others I'm like, oh, wow, this is like amazingly rich because it's got all the stuff that you would need to reproduce literally everything in this, you know, in this article or this blog post. So I think there's a lot of great examples out there. Anybody who has a blogdown website has all of the source code for anything that includes our code in it on their website repository. So I definitely often go back to the source code for people's blog posts to be able to see exactly how they made that figure. The question of if I would copy and paste and then kind of plop things in it, I don't think I've ever done that like routinely. Maybe if I was trying to make small changes to something and I needed to start with a new document for some reason, but I think generally I don't necessarily have like a recipe for what an outline would be for a good one. I usually more had like, and I think I even had like an RStudio community post. It was one of my first RStudio community posts where somebody asked for like an R Markdown workflow. I'll try to find the link in a second. But I would usually have like more like my files were named a certain thing. And I would usually try to have my project hierarchy and organization dictated by my file structure. And then within an individual R Markdown document, it was like whatever I needed, whatever headings I needed, whatever code I needed. So sometimes they were mainly about making plots. Sometimes it was mainly about wrangling. Sometimes it was all trying to figure out how to import this silly data set because it was giving me problems. Or maybe I'd have one that was just about making tables because I started making a table and realized that I needed a lot more code than I wanted to put in this other document. So I started up a new document. So I think the modular workflows really was something that I did actually really embrace. I would usually try to come up with, piecemeal things that I could accomplish in a document and keep them there, and then label the document as such so that I could keep track of what that document did. So if I was doing like a linear model and then I wanted to do like mixed effects model, I'd probably label the document that, and then use the same processing script to make sure that the data is the same, but then kind of start anew and try to, I think I'll say one thing that is more of a philosophical statement, but it's that I think a lot of times when people worry too much about like which format to use, should I use R or should I use a .r or .rmd, or like how should I organize this? Usually my advice is like just do whatever you're gonna do, like just go for it, just start writing and just start using it, and then you'll come up with your own format that actually makes sense to you. And that's kind of the best way to form your preferences, is just to try using it, see what's useful to you, because there's no necessarily like recipe here. Like I can't say that I have a recipe for like when I start an R Markdown document where I know I'm going to get to, but certainly for once you start using it, you'll have your own preferences for things. But I have like a recipe for what makes a good blog post for me that has data, something like that. Like I have kind of specific recipes that I would follow a format for. Does that make sense? I'll try to find that community post because it's kind of funny to look back. It was before I started working at RStudio.
You have a question that I want to get to in the chat, but I want to take this one other hand from my family.
Movanwe.
Your name.
Movanwe.
Movanwe.
Hi. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Cool.
Yes.
Okay, I have it's a question, but it's also like a general request and also like a poll. So I'm wondering, because I fall into this group of R Markdown users that like I use it all the time and I have a pretty good understanding, I think, of what is happening, but I like shy away from adopting new features or like using add-on packages or a lot of the like actively developing ecosystem, because I have never really seen a good presentation or explanation of like what is going on under the hood. And because like there's a lot. It's like R Markdown is a markup language and also a package and also a file format. And then there's Markdown, and the interaction between knitr and pandoc is like mysterious. So I am interested in like kind of a geeky webinar or series or something where one of the people like Alison or even Yue or somebody who's a developer of these things who deeply understands what is going on under the hood can just kind of present that to adopters in a way. And maybe that's not what everybody is interested in, but it's very much what I'm interested in before I like adopt new packages or tools. So yeah, I just want to see if that is if something that you guys would be interested in doing, or if anybody else would be interested in that as well. So not just like style guides and stuff, but actually like, here's what is happening computationally under the hood, and here's the order of operations.
Yeah. I know you're asking also, I'll just chime in here quickly too. I'm with you. Like, I feel like I'm a very prolific R Markdown user, but I'm not a power user. Like I do it my way and it feels great. And then I learn about, I'm like, parameters, those seem really powerful. Are they something I need in my life? And, like just seeing folks chatting about that on Twitter and seeing examples, I'm like, oh, you know what? I'm not creating the same report for different parameters. So that's something that's, I feel okay about letting go right now.
I'll try something new and it won't work. And I don't know if it's not working because there's something unique about my code, or if it's, if I knew more about what was happening under the hood, I might be able to debug it.
I think probably like just speaking to trying out a new tool, we build in templates for every new format, and those are the best way to get started. And even for not RStudio, our Markdown output formats, like I found myself recently needing to learn Office down. And I wish I had known that there was a built-in template. I should have known because we do that, but I didn't realize that there was. And that was a really great way to get started. So kind of trying to separate it out from inserting anything that you want to do, but just saying like, I'm going to spend like 20 minutes and download the package, open up the new template, see how they've structured it, what the YAML looks like. I mean, I think one of the big problems that we have is that YAML is very hard to document. And we recently went through this on the R Markdown team when we created all these new package down sites for all of our packages, because we wanted to help users be able to see the help reference documents online a little bit easier. And we ran into these problems where we're like, well, we can't document YAML very easily. We're actually building some stuff into the IDE to be able to better debug YAML. So there's gonna be like some autocomplete, some help functions, and some like warning messages on the side of the IDE when you use the YAML key that's wrong. But yeah, like your mental model should be that there's our Markdown package is, and I wish I could share my slides from like every R Markdown workshop that I do starts off with like, what is R Markdown? It's a package, it's a language, it's
and maybe my problem is just I haven't looked at enough of those presentations yet.
Well, it's something where you feel like I feel like I say it all the time, but I know that not everybody knows it. So I'm trying to find like any example that I have just so I can like have a visual to riff off of for a second. Let me see. R Markdown for pharma website. Can I share my screen, Julie, or
you can?
Yep. Am I going to be blocked?
I also want to be conscious of time, so we're at the like 2 minutes to the end of this call, but go ahead and share, and we'll have this as our last question.
It's giving me a block for some reason, but it's because I'm on a different computer. But I can share the link in the slide. So like, here's where I would normally start. So I guess my first like thought is that usually when I talk about this stuff, I talk about all the different things that R Markdown could be, but also like, it's okay if it's a little bit of wizardry to you and you use what's helpful to you. And if you're ever starting to use a new package because you think that the output format is useful to you, you know, the best way to discover more about it is to look at the documentation online and figure out what are the things. We usually try to follow like a typical workflow in terms of documenting the YAML and then documenting some of the interesting things that you can do in the actual text itself. So sometimes we've enabled some interesting things with knitr or, you know, some different like Markdown shortcuts or something. But really, for the most part, our the ones that come out of RStudio are all like each additional package is basically taking Pandoc and something you can do with Pandoc and then injecting something additional that we want to make easier for people to use that other people can use that are not our users, but we want them to be able to inject R and R Markdown into it. So like blogdown, for example, is R Markdown plus making Hugo. Shringen is R Markdown plus using Remark.js for slides. Flex Dashboard is, I believe, using a grid CSS layout in addition to R Markdown. So you get access to these additional things, and they're things that we don't want to build into the main R Markdown package because they're dependencies, they're more things. So we've made it so that each individual package gives you like these superpowers for this one specific tool. So a lot of times when you have a slide deck versus a Flex Dashboard versus a book down, you're going to have different metadata and different YAML keys that you need for that, because that just kind of is how that format works. Like a slide deck would have, you know, a title slide, a sense of a title slide, for example, whereas a Flex Dashboard doesn't have that, but that might have column and row layouts, whereas that doesn't make sense for slides. So there's definitely like a little bit of spelunking that unfortunately I think is kind of a natural process of learning a new format, but definitely starting with a template and making sure that you can knit that. If you can't knit our template, then file a GitHub issue, because that's our problem. That's not your problem. But once you start injecting your own code and changing YAML stuff and going kind of a little bit off grid or feeling like you're flailing, then it might be that, you know, kind of scale it back. I always go back to the template and make sure I can knit the template even when I'm troubleshooting anything.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Alison and everyone. Sorry, Erin, to cut you off.
No, I was just going to say the same thing. I put some links in the chat for the ability to follow Alison on Twitter, to follow us, to get on the mailing list. But we really appreciate all of you who showed up and your time. I know that people are dropping off now, but thanks so much, Alison.
Yeah.
Thank you all. This was very fun.
Yeah, I love chatting about R Markdown and learning from you. So thank you. Bye, everyone.
And we'll save the chat. There's a lot of good stuff in the chat too. So
Perfect.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank
bye,
you.
everybody.
Blog post.
Thanks so much.